Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So let's begin our session with a wonderful quote. If you can cultivate the right attitude, your enemies are your best spiritual teachers become their presence provides you with the opportunities to enhance and develop tolerance, patience, and understanding. So further, starting a new chapter of I Learning, I, Chitala Karthik, being your host for today's event, I want to extend a warm welcome of all present here. I hope you are all doing amazing. As we know that the focus of your breath can be ground you in the present of movement. Deep concentration breath can calm your minds, help you become more awareness of your surroundings. Participating mindful meditation is one of the most effective ways to develop presence. It involves paying full attention to present movements, observing your thoughts and feelings without judgment. On behalf of the whole SEMS family, I welcome you all for today's international webinar on the topic of cultivating presence. And to add our guest of honor and today's speaker, Mr. Bradley Dennis McDavid. It is a great honor to you, sir. We are grateful for your presence. Now let me introduce today's speaker, Mr. Bradley Dennis McDavid, to you all. As we know that as long teacher and precursor of the performance and creativity, he made the decision to help the other inhabit their own innovative superpowers of creating, thinking, and living by developing a coach of particularly of presence. In the both his professional work and scholarship, his focus in the psychology of creating and how our stories created and shape our lives. He used a varieties of cognitive tools of bringing clients into hyper focus and engage solution by they utilize their own creative energies as primary source of the innovation.
All right. So to begin with, thank you, Karthik. Thank you, Lakshmi. And thank you to Digi Shaksham for inviting me here. Namaste to everybody. It's
Okay.
early here on the East Coast of North Carolina in the United States. So I want to ask you to be patient with me as I proceed through this material. The name of the talk is Cultivating Presence. And it's nice to get a sense of who's here, and especially given the fact that so many mindfulness practices have originated from your part of the world, both in Hindu and in Buddhist practices, this idea of cultivating these ideas. So the name of my talk today is Cultivating Presence. However, the subtitle is actually a little bit longer. So the subtitle of this is Increasing Metacognition, Agency, and Attention in Life and Work. So my name is Bradley Dennis. I am a development coach, an organizational consultant. I'm a professional performer. I've got over 30 years experience in creating and acting and directing and teaching theater to diverse audiences all over the world. And through that practice, I've developed a set of tools and techniques that harness our attention and improve our metacognition primarily through somatic awareness, through play, and through learning how to enter flow states. And today I'm really eager to share some of these tools with you. And it's my hope that they will be of use to you in your everyday life as well as in your work environment. So I want to take a moment and share a little bit about myself and my credentials. So as I said, I'm a development coach. I'm a master theater teacher. I'm also a depth psychology scholar. I'm also a husband of 20 years. We've been married and I have two daughters, teenage daughters, 13 and 15. Yes, you can shed a tear for me right now. So I teach depth psychology at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in Santa Barbara, and I'm also trained in the presence-based coaching pedagogy. I'm affiliated with both the ICF and the IOC. I'm an active member in several psychological fellowships, including the Jung Society. And incidentally, I was for nearly a decade a CrossFit coach and athlete. I've traveled around the world from Romania to Hong Kong, performing and teaching. And I am, in addition to being a personal development coach, an accomplished musician. That's me on the drums. I am an avid rock climber. This is a couple pictures. That's me in Romania with a school of deaf orphans doing a theater workshop. And then bottom left of your screen, you can see me as a naked savage in a show with some wild costumes there in Edinburgh in the year 2000. I say all that basically to say that I live my dreams pretty much every day, and it's a real focus of mine to stay present. And I want to share some of those tools with you. So, what do we mean when we say presence? Right? Presence implies inhabiting the present moment, the now. It can be kind of a difficult word to define, but we know it intimately. It's an availability to the present moment, but it also encapsulates so much more. So we often speak of an impressive presence when referring to a great achiever, right? They take over the room. They have a real deep presence. Or we talk about having presence of mind to remember to ask for something in the moment. But all of us know what that feels like. So think about a friend listening to you tell a story. Or when you take a breath and you're letting go of the past or the future, or your first bite of your favorite sweet treat, and you're just enveloped in a sensory moment that absolutely brings you squarely into the present. It could be a genuine laugh. So presence affords us this expansive sense of the moment. It creates space just to be. And we'll talk more about that word in a moment, being. We might call presence an invested energy towards being available to what is, rather than what was or what might be. So presence implies this immersion into the physical. It's an awareness of awareness, which is actually the definition of metacognition. So in a sense of being, we experience that we are very similar, very, very plain. But in addition to that, it also implies being conscious to the fact that you're in a body in space and time. We're not just a floating head with stalks that move us around. So many of us live existences, especially at work, where we just think neck up. Now, here's a fun fact. The body is always in the present. In fact, there's no other place for it to live. And we'll touch back on that in a moment. So it also implies a heightened availability to your senses. So when we're present, we are more available to our hearing, to our touch. Sense of touch is heightened, to our eyesight, to sight. Things taste a little different, right? We are in our bodies in a way that is very, very specific when we're present. Now, that also opens up something else for us. When we're available to our bodies, when we're available to our senses, we now have a interconnection with the world. We're open to what's actually happening. So in one case, it's sort of like we're peeling an onion. We start with the core of our being becoming present. And then as things start to open up through our senses, we see the world. You can imagine that's exactly what a baby does, right? The baby first starts crawling, sensing, feeling. As those senses start to open up, it becomes aware of the rest of the world. We improve our situational awareness. When we improve our situational awareness, we can now communicate with those things that are bringing us information, that sensory input. And so that gives us a chance to actually show up and communicate. And as many of you are certainly aware, these states are delicate, right? They can vanish in a moment. We might be in a moment of reverie. We might be feeling something expansive, and something happens all of a sudden, and we're thinking about bills, or we're thinking about something that happened in the past. So you know that this happens in just an instant. And one of the tools that we're trying to access here is how to stay in the present moment. As one of my wonderful mentors, the coach who teaches presence-based coaching, her name's Beatrice Hansen. She says the only moment that we have any control over is the present moment. So that's where we do our work. That's where we try to stay. It's not so easy though, as anyone who has experimented with meditation knows. It comes and goes quite quickly. So let's look at this idea of attention. Attention is simply that which we find salient enough to give our attention to. I like to think of the quality of my attention as a kind of a light, which might change given the circumstances. So if I'm looking for something or trying to connect with someone, I might think of my attention as a bright searchlight or a stage light. But it could also be a small candle held to the pages of a good book, right? My attention is now focused and brought in. Dr. Joe Dispenza and many others have observed that where attention goes, energy flows. And it's a process of which we're often completely unaware or sometimes absent altogether, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we live in a world that is overrun with information, right? Constant bombardment. You see the results of this bombardment everywhere in startling statistics about declining mental health. There is an increase in self-harm in young people. Much of it is linked to the ever-growing weight of data that's coming into our lives. And in a rush to stay afloat in this torrent of information, not everyone can swim well. And the work we're discussing today addresses that. This is a quote from the American economist and political scientist Herbert Simon, and I'll just read it. In an information-rich world, the wealth of information means a dearth of something else, a scarcity of whatever it is that information consumes. What information consumes is rather obvious. It consumes the attention of its recipients. Hence, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. I want to repeat that last line. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. Just sit with that for a second, because so many of us are now inundated all day, all the time with a huge array of options that are just threatening to overwhelm us. How do we choose what's important? How do we choose which things to focus on? I don't know about you, but I have come up in a world where I wanted to do all of the things and therefore didn't do any of them well. I wanted to rock climb, and I wanted to be a race car driver, and I wanted to be an architect. And you can't do all of the things. You have to, at some point, focus down. And this work that we're discussing will address specifically that phenomenon. Here's another great quote about attention. Attention is a creative act. This is another one that we have to sit with for a second. What does that mean? Dr. Ian McGilchrist is the author of a book called The Master and His Emissary. He's one of the biggest influences in my scholarship right now. The statement refers to the way that our brains actually interact with the world and how the nature of that interaction actually changes us neurochemically and physiologically. So if you're not familiar with his work, he writes about how we fundamentally misunderstand the reason that nearly all living creatures have this asymmetrically bifurcated CPU, right? Our brains. What are the two hemispheres for? So if I could ask everyone to mute their microphones. Wonderful. Thank you for that. All right. So all of us, I'm assuming, have a brain in our heads. And we live with this general assumption that the left hemisphere is the logic brain and the right is the creative brain, and that we use the parts we need and that they work together to get things done. And there is some truth in the tendency of each side, right? The left is this logical, mathematics, scientific wonder, and that the right is this creative, emotional, just frou-frou artist, and that we really don't need the right hemisphere. It's the left that gets the work done. It's a gross oversimplification and actually misses some fairly large details. And the title of McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, refers specifically to those two hemispheres, that we have preferenced, in his opinion, the wrong hemisphere, that it's not the left that should be in charge, but in fact, the right. And we'll talk about why in a second. So one of the things about the brain is it has these two hemispheres. They're not symmetrical, which is odd, even though when you look at almost every illustration of the brain, they look symmetrical. I mean, even in the one that I've provided here, it just looks like a mirror image. It's not true. Usually one is smaller. The folds and creases and hips and valleys are always different. But why? That was the major question that McGilchrist asked. And he started to investigate this by looking at stroke victims who either had the majority of function on one hemisphere or the other severely depleted, so that he could see what were the behavioral characteristics of someone who had predominantly left hemispheric function and no right hemisphere, and vice versa, predominantly right hemispheric function without much left. So to begin with, the corpus callosum is the part of the brain that actually bridges and allows the two hemispheres to communicate. According to the popular theories, that's how the two communicate, and that it's an information superhighway, and that it's there to help us actually think clearer. Turns out that's completely false. Its function, the corpus callosum, its function is largely inhibitory. It actually reduces communication between the two hemispheres. And why would that be? Well, the reason is it's not because we have one brain with two halves. It's because we have, in fact, two brains. So it turns out that rather than one brain with two halves, they function quite differently. Oh, I'm going to go back to the previous slide there. I want to tell you a story about a bird. So almost every creature with a brain on our planet has a bifurcated central processing unit, whether it's a bird, whether it's a lizard, whether it's a monkey, whether it's a human, two halves. And so McGilchrist started trying to figure out why. What could those possibly do to help us? For a long time, it was thought, well, if one gets damaged, the other can sort of take over. It's not the case at all. So I want you to imagine that you are a bird, a small bird, let's say a sparrow. You're at the edge of a large field. You've got a seed or maybe a pile of seeds or nuts at your feet. The left brain is fabulous at picking up that seed, examining it, looking at the detail, cracking it open, pulling the meat out, breaking things down into its most smallest constituent parts, and then eating it, right? That's survival. I need to look, I need to find out how this works, I need to know what's relevant to me so that I can survive. So that's the left hemisphere. What it's terrible at, it turns out, is seeing the hawk on the other side of the field, or the snake creeping up behind it, or the other birds coming to come in. So our two brains work in a particular way. The left is, and you can see this in the paradigm of the scientific revolution, in the industrial revolution, in all of the way that most of Western modernity engages in the world, right? So the left brain categorizes, it labels. This is good, this is bad. It perceives everything as mechanistic, right? How does it work? It's all material. There's no consciousness there. It's dead, it's inert. You can see this in how industry plunders the planet for resources without seeing the interconnectedness of things, without seeing the impact, without seeing the relationships. It's just, oh, there's more. We're going to take that. We're going to store it, those kinds of things. It looks for utility. And it's black and white in its thinking. It doesn't perceive nuance. It doesn't perceive metaphor. One of the great experiments that McGilchrist did, he was working with a man whose right hemisphere, which controls the left side of the body. Remember, there's a crossing of the wires there. It's a phenomenal design, very strange. And this man who had had a stroke and damage in his right hemisphere was in his left brain. And when asked, how do you sleep? How did you sleep? Or how do you feel? He would say, on my side, or with my hand, completely missing the nuance of the question. So what does the right do then? So if the right is about seeing the larger perspective and seeing the bigger picture, it understands nuance. It understands metaphor. One of the reasons it's associated with creativity is because of this perception of depth and interrelatedness in things, right? It sees all of the things going on. Excuse me. It also integrates feeling and sensation. So in McGilchrist's view, we are better off, and in fact are built to preference our right mind, and that is what we should do, and hence the title of the book, The Master and His Emissary, is to preference the right hemisphere. And this work of presencing, of being mindful, of increasing metacognition, largely involves us being aware of which hemisphere we're using. Now, many people think that things are compartmentalized, that language comes from the left and art comes from the right. We use both sides for most things, but there's modalities, qualities of attention that are endemic to both sides. And those are the things that we want to look at, in particular, the right hemisphere and how it sees the world. So this question is, how can we get into our right minds? I would like to share a personal story with you about how I became a theater performer. It's also the first time that I experienced this amazing sensation of presence. So I was about 5 years old. My parents took me to see a Japanese bunraku puppetry performance. Now, if you're not familiar with Japanese bunraku, it's an 18th century form that became legendary court entertainment. The entire kabuki theater can come right into the feudal lord's castle, right? Because it's small, it's just 3 puppeteers. The master puppeteer, who you can see there without a face covering, guides the right hand and guides the head, and has earned the right to display his face because of his ability. It's sort of a revered position. But the left hand and the legs are controlled by the hooded apprentices. So after you do, I think it's about 10 years of practice with the legs, then you can graduate to the left hand. Do another 10, 15, maybe 20 years of that. Then you can become the master puppeteer. But those 2 apprentices remained masked so as not to distract this performance. So I was completely fascinated by this, the delicate features, the opulent costumes, the lifelike manipulation, and the worlds that were created from this puppeteer. But when I saw the show, I only saw one puppeteer. I saw the master, the maestro, because his face is visible, and I thought he was doing all of the things. It was amazing that one man could so deftly create this lifelike performance out of a puppet. Then I saw the other 2 puppeteers, and I remember it like it was yesterday because my mind exploded. And of course, they had been there all along, but they were so deft at disappearing and fading and becoming one with the background that I didn't see them. And so that was the moment that I understood my first lesson about the power of presence, that these 2 performers were able to so control their presence that they could literally disappear and then reappear with my close and careful attention. So in that moment, I experienced this flood of awareness, both internally and externally. This is what the cognitive scientist Dr. John Vervaeke would call a reciprocal opening. So let's just take a second to explore some of the basics of cognitive neuroscience, and particularly the 4E approach to cognition, which argues that cognition does not occur solely in the head, but it's also embodied and embedded, enacted, and extended by the way of extracranial or outside the brain processes and structures. Though it's very much in vogue right now, 4E, it's received relatively few critical evaluations, but I think what we want to look at here is this idea of embodied and enacted. So reciprocal opening means that as I become open to your being and your doing, something changes in me. I experience a widening of perception. And if you are experiencing that, we have this mutual reciprocal opening to a third thing. It's what the Greeks would call dialogos. It's the root of the word dialogue, the idea that I come to a table to present my ideas, you come to a table to present your ideas, and if we're in this reciprocal opening, we can have a communication where we're examining each other's ideas, asking questions, and between us on the table, a third thing emerges, right? And that in order to be in that receptive place of communication, of reciprocal opening, we have to be in a position of mutual affordance. And I'll talk about that in a second. This also helps us make sense of what is in the world. We call this salience landscaping. So given the sheer amount of data we process, right? We talked a little bit about that, this information overload. Our minds must determine what is important what to ignore, what could be useful, those kinds of things. We call this in CogSci salience landscaping. We're helping to create a map of importance, what's salient. It helps us foreground things that are important and helps us background things that aren't. This process of getting into presence and embodied and enacted reciprocal opening improves our ability to separate the signal from the noise, to find what's important and salient to us, and to background everything else. This also gives us a sense of agency because, as I said before, the only moment that we have any control over is the present moment, that the body is already there, that once we arrive in that place, we're not so worried. We can be informed by the past, but we're not there. And we can be informed by our desires and thinking about the future, but we're not there. We're here in the moment. That gives you agency. So embodiment. What is embodiment? Let me start and ask you all to help me with an experiment. You're going to need your fingers in the chat for this one. I want you to take a second, close your eyes, and I want you to think of a time when you felt really good in your body. Maybe eating your favorite food or having a conversation with a friend, seeing a beautiful sunset or landscape, or maybe with your children. Think of a time when you felt at home in your body. Feel that, pull it into your awareness. Now, what percentage of the time that you are at work do you feel like that? And put that number in the chat. Kimberly's leading the pack. Kimberly works hard at this. That's an impressive number, 75%. What about others? Lakshmi, amazing, 80%. You guys are definitely the outliers in this process. Wonderful, 80%. So when I do this work with CEOs, nonprofits, the answers I get are 0%, 5%. Maybe CEOs will sometimes say 10% because, of course, they're in charge and they get to relax a little bit sometimes. Yeah, 80%, 60%. That's amazing. You guys, I want to ask more questions about it because I think a lot of this has to do with maybe cultural practices. There's a real, such a rich and deep history of mindfulness in India in particular. So this really stands out to me. This is wonderful. But can you imagine, for most people, 5% of the time that they're at work, they're in their body. They feel a sense of happiness. So the big focus of my work is to help people increase that number radically and hopefully permanently. So let's talk a little bit about the body-mind connection. This is a quote from Bessel van der Kolk. I think I just murdered his last name. Van der Kolk. Bessel van der Kolk. Got to get my Dutch accent in here. And he writes, as long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know, and that takes an enormous amount of courage. So I heard a wonderful quote from a therapist the other day about this very phenomenon, and she said it so expressively. She said, the feeling that cannot find its expression in tears will make other organs weep. The feeling that cannot find its expression in tears will make other organs weep. That means the things that we suppress, the darkness, the shadows, the pain, the fear, those emotions, if they're not allowed full expression, cause illness in the body. Remember, the title of van der Kolk's book is The Body Keeps the Score. This idea that the body holds trauma, the body holds experiences. And like I said before, the body exists in the present. There's no other place for it to go. It's only the mind that goes to the past and to the future. And so as we're thinking about, let's remember all of these parts, right? The right hemisphere, seeing the big picture, getting into our right minds, finding ways to become embodied, to join the mind with the physical present experience of the body. That those are key both to working through trauma, to experiencing flow states, to experiencing creativity, to joy. All of these things that are afforded to us when we have those reciprocal openings, that mutual affordance, that is the work of embodied experience. But how do we get there? That's the question. So, the reason for this whole dichotomy is the very nature of our lives, right? We're caught between doing and being. Now, I think I'm speaking to a largely converted audience here, given these percentages of time that you guys feel embodied and that you feel a holistic sense of yourself. So I'm very curious in our Q&A to talk a little bit more about the qualities that you experience in here. But work so often for people focuses on doing, right? Doing, doing, doing. What did you do? How did you do it? What other ways can we do that, right? The image I get is that of a hamster wheel. Doing is this narrow band of attention, and doing is important, right? Certainly we need doers to make things happen. And that's certainly important in our lives again. But without balance, we experience what we discovered in that experiment, or what so many have discovered in that experiment, is that a large part of us is missing. So some of you said 60%, 80%. We're shooting for the whole 100. We want that whole present body experience, because that is what affords us, I mean, except when we're sleeping, that is what affords us those deep insights and connection to our innermost power. Get back to that in a second. So what is this part of us that's missing? What is on the other side of all that? It's the being. Being kind of sits back. It's not passive, but it's receptive. It's observant. It provides this possibility and potential, which sounds a lot like right hemisphere thinking. So how do we train this? How do we prime ourselves for deep present, for highly relevant attention, and the ability to create and perceive a space in our minds between a stimulus and a response? This is where embodied wisdom practices can help. What do I mean by embodied wisdom practices? So in my case, I came up as an actor, right? An actor is a professional beer and doer. And we call it a play for a reason. We call it make-believe for a reason. But this is a perfect example of what is available to us at all times. Now, I'm going to focus on acting and improv and theater games for this example. But there are lots of other examples of embodied wisdom practices, many of which come from India. Physical yoga practices, meditation practices. My rock climbing is an embodied wisdom practice. Cooking can be an embodied wisdom practice, but we'll talk more about that in a second. So it's available to us at all times. It's a repositioning of our own consciousness by our own consciousness. And this is what we mean by metacognition, the ability to think about our thinking. So what we discover is that in order to be in our right minds, we have to relearn how to play. So play gives you all of these parameters to explore. We call it the magic what if. Play gives you a safe space in which to explore with the body, with speech, with action, with all of these different things. And what does that afford us? It affords us enhanced meaning in the world, a sense of purpose. It improves our ability to know ourselves in a deep and meaningful way. It improves our emotional intelligence. It improves our ability to see and separate the stimulus from the response, right? So many of us get grabbed by other people, other outside influences, that this work allows us to be able to see and hold those embodied experiences of emotion. And moving through that, this is where the 4 E's of cognition, especially embodied and enacted cognition, come into play. So I get this term embodied wisdom practice from John Vervaeke's work. John Vervaeke is a professor of cognitive science and psychology at the University of Toronto. He has a wonderful series on YouTube called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, and I highly recommend that series if you're not familiar with it already, if you're interested in learning more about some of this stuff. So what do we do with this? What can we employ to get through this? I mean, martial arts would be one example of an embodied wisdom practice, a Tai Chi, karate, judo, a jujitsu. Also, yoga we talked about, Pilates, body work, anything that joins in physicality our minds in a state of play in a safe space to try new things, to improve our physical, mental dexterity and coordination, even walking with awareness, right? I don't know if you're familiar with this term forest bathing, this idea of walking through a forest and just bathing in the beauty. For me, observing beauty is an embodied wisdom practice. But certainly theater, finding a theater class, trying improv, trying dance or movement, using your body and exploring your own mechanism actually helps you see and chart when you're switching between these two brains. So there's a great Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, you may be familiar with. He has a thought experiment. It's called Bathing the Buddha, which I love this and I use this all the time. The next time you find yourself in a task that you dislike, the example that he uses is washing the dishes. Imagine, and there's the power of the right hemisphere, imagining, that each dish is the baby Buddha. So when you put a cup in your hands, it's the Buddha. And you wouldn't give the Buddha anything less than the most loving, deep clean you could possibly provide. You would be careful with it. You would clean delicately. You would make sure you weren't chipping any of the surfaces. You would make sure it was spotless. You would rinse it, set it down gently. There's the Buddha. You pick up another dish, another Buddha, another opportunity for that mindfulness to pour into there. That exercise in other frameworks, for instance, creative thinking, is called gamifying. So when you take a normal sort of quotidian enterprise and you infuse it with this sense of play, what if? What if this was the Buddha? What if? What if it was a nuclear bomb? Oh, you'd wash the dishes very differently. So these kinds of games that we play include us in the process and actually transform our everyday lives and everyday mundane activities into something absolutely critical for getting into our right mind, out of the analytical into the possible, into the creative, into the open sense of relationships and nuance. So I want to ask you guys to try another experiment. And this is, I haven't done this one with a Zoom audience before, so I'm very curious to see how this goes. So I want to assume that everyone's sitting. I can't see everybody, but in your seat, I want you just to put both feet on the floor and take your hands and you're going to grab the bottom of your seat, just lightly for now. So right now, I want you to imagine that you are in an airplane or a spaceship and you are in the cockpit and you're holding on and the plane is going over this beautiful landscape. You see this incredible landscape. All of the sudden, you have to hold on, and please do this, hold on tightly below because you're upside down. Close your eyes and imagine that you're having to hold yourself in your seat to prevent yourself from falling out of your chair. So if you don't hold on tightly, you're just going to fall out of the open cockpit of the airplane into your death. So you're upside down. You've got to hold on. You've got to hold on. You've got to hold on. And now release. Close your eyes and sense the change in your body. What happened? So you've just played a game with yourself. You just became present in the imaginal. And that's an actual place. There's a wonderful depth psychologist named Henri Corbin who studied Sufism. And he specifically talked about this idea of the imaginal as a real place, especially in Sufi lore and mythology. And the imaginal, it's different than the imagination. It's the realm between consciousness and unconsciousness. So when you are just about to wake up from sleep and you've been dreaming, you've been in the imaginal. And it feels real, doesn't it? It feels absolutely tactile. You can move around in that space. And as we said before, the body can't tell the difference between imagined experiences and actual experiences. So when we're doing this kind of embodied imagining, we are creating the conditions in our bodies to actually manifest and live in those conditions. So the more we can create those imaginal spaces in our lives through this wonderful version of what if, it's truly transformative. Now, I want to thank you guys for your attention. I want to make sure I leave enough time for all of the questions or comments that we might get and talking about this. I love talking to folks about this world, and especially helping individuals and teams dive deeper into developing these creative pathways towards these skills. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation, please do reach out to me. But the punchlines here are, to get in our right minds, we have to become embodied. We have to find an embodied wisdom practice. And that embodied wisdom practice affords us an expansive sense of this moment, where we are right now. And the only moment we have any change and effect on is now. So thank you guys so much for your attention, your focus.
Wow,
And
what a
I will.
wonderful knowledge given by you, sir. I hope our audience learned many new things from this session. I would like to highlight some of the points like better communication, sense of being, awareness of body, clear thinking. It was very effective for our audience. Again, thank you, sir, for joining and sharing your experience and precious time and knowledge with us, sir. Sir, there are a few questions which our audience want to be answered. So, with your permission, shall we start? So, the first question is, what does presence mean to you and why it is important in our life? Hello? Hello?
I can hear you.
Sir, the first question is, what does presence mean to you and why is it is important in our life?
What does presence mean to me? So it's interesting because when I went back to grad school to get my degree in psychology, the major question that I had was, how can I take the things that I'm most passionate about in theater, which was this sense of creating safe space, the sense of presence, the sense of wonder. Because what an actor's job is to study human nature, to study life, to study the world. That every moment a good actor is alive is a teaching moment. And so as you become more conversant with that training, you have to watch very closely how people act. You have to watch how they move. You have to watch how you move. You have to see what your habits are. You have to be able to step out of them and step into another character in a moment. You have to be able to, I don't know if you're familiar with Orisi dance in your country. Those actors have to be able to control their bodies so precisely that in the time it takes for them to do an entire revolution, turn around, they have to produce tears. Can you imagine? It's a hyper state of awareness, of physical awareness, of internal sensory awareness, and that fascinated me. The performance I could take or leave, but that affordance of moving through life in this sense of wonder and possibility and information gathering, presence not only affords me the ability to be with myself and to know myself intimately and what I'm capable of, also affords me the ability to empathize, to see, to step into someone else's experience. Remember, I talked about dialogue and dialogos, that truth is not an edifice. Truth is not a noun, that you have a version of truth and I have a version of truth. The real meaning to me of truth is that we come to the table and truth is continually revealed as we become present with one another and talk about what we think truth is. That's really what presence affords to me. And that's why I think it's so important now, is because it allows people space between stimulus and reaction. So many of us, especially online, the first thing we want to do is tell people how we think about things and what's correct and what's not correct. We're very quick to criticize. So presence gives us space. Presence affords us this ability to see the other as valid. And in fact, my religious background is Quakerism, which is a belief of the divine in everyone. And I think that's probably most religious traditions hold that. But to me, that's the fundamental component of almost every spiritual tradition in the world, is trying to get to that place. So that's why it's important to me. Long answer for a short question.
Yes, sir, thank you for answering. The next question is, how do you want others to see you?
Ooh, how do I want others to see me? I gave up on that ambition a long time ago. I want others to see me honestly and compassionately. I'm avoiding saying I want them to see me as smart or clever or strong or sexy or those things. I want them to see me with humility. I want them to see me clearly. I want them to see my faults. I want them to see with a compassionate and generous spirit. How's that?
Yes, sir. That's a very can you identify any specific goals or intentions for developing a strong sense of presence in your life? What step you can take to achieve these goals?
Can you repeat the question?
Can you identify any specific goals for developing a strong sense of presence in your life?
Hmm.
What step can you take to achieve these goals?
So I had an interesting experience I'll share with you. I worked with a theater company for almost a decade, and everyone in the company was at least 10 years older than I was. And I was the only non-founding member of the company. So I came in as a young upstart, and they had been doing this work for a long time. And when we created all original work, and so we would go into these rehearsals and improvise and write and do all this sort of stuff. And there was one rehearsal, we had just done some improvising, and we sat down to start brainstorming. And everybody came up with these amazing ideas, just brilliant. And I was blown away. And my pen just was still, nothing coming out. Nothing. And in a moment of pure frustration, I stood up and I started pacing. And the moment that I did that, the ideas started coming. And it was the one of the most important lessons for me as a person on the planet is that for me, it's one of the reasons why I'm standing right now. I have to move in order to think, which sounds like a very strange thing to say, but it's true. For me, my best ideas, my best thinking, all comes when I go for a walk, all comes when I exercise, all comes when I'm rock climbing, all comes when I'm embodied. So, again, this idea of bringing our presence into the body, moving the body, at least for me, affords me this sense of openness and possibility and potential that otherwise, when I sit down and the body starts to calm and the mind starts to get kind of a little bit bigger in its, oh, I'm in charge here, that tends to pull me out of good creative thinking. Does that answer your question? There was a second part. I forgot what it was.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, how do you currently deal with stress? And how might cultivating presence help you manage these challenges more effectively?
Mm. So when we're practicing presence, we're trying to be present with what is. This is super easy when we're talking about pleasant things, right? Because they're nice. We're always going towards a sense of ease and a sense of pleasure in our lives. It's most challenging when there's stress. It's most challenging when there's anxiety. And so part of the strength of this work is regardless of how I see or view the stress, I get to participate how I want to. So let's say I've lost all my money and I'm not sure how I'm going to eat, right? I can project into the future a horrible scenario. And if I'm living there in that, I can see, being destitute, being out on the street, being uh, having to steal or do less than savory things to try to make sure that my needs are met. That suddenly I'm going into solution mode. I'm trying to solve problems. Being present with what is gives you options. So when you're able to step back, you can see, wow, I'm really anxious about this. Oh, cool. I'm going to set that there. It doesn't have to tell me who I am and how I am. That's just a part. There's a wonderful therapeutic tool called IFS, which stands for Internal Family Systems. And it's this idea that inside of all of us are several voices. I kind of think of it like a boardroom. Some people think of it like a family dinner table where there's different roles around your psyche. I have for me personally, one of the loudest voices is the critic, the one who tells me, this is really, you're no good and you should just go have a beer or do something else. There's also some hopeful voices, all of those things. So in stressful times, some of those voices get very loud, some of those negative voices. But this embodiment practice gives us the space to listen and differentiate. Who is that talking? Oh, right. It's the fear of being abandoned I had as a kid. Or who's that talking? Oh, it's that part of me that just wants to be famous and rich or whatever the case may be. I can differentiate that from me, the capital S self, who has autonomy and space to go, yeah, I don't want to be anxious about this. I see that there's a problem, but I'm going to be proactive and move through this with a little more grace.
Thank you, sir. Sir, how does the concept of impermanence influence your approach to cultivate presence and approaching each moment of life?
One more time.
How does the concept of impermanence influence your approach to cultivating the presence and appreciating the each moment of life?
The concept of
Impermanence influence.
impermanence.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I'm a big believer in karma, and this kind of leads into maybe a different webinar, a different conversation. But I'm also a big fan of quantum physics, and in particular, the discovery in quantum physics of the primacy of consciousness over the material world, meaning that what the right hemisphere has always known is in fact true, that consciousness is fundamental to the universe. Now, this is, you can kind of theorize different things, but this idea of impermanence to me is linked very closely with that. The image that comes to me is that we are, or I am, a consciousness in a material bubble, as opposed to my consciousness being a bubble in a material world. Because I've heard people say that we're not humans having a spiritual experience, we're spirits having a human experience, which kind of points to it. But for me, when I think of or imagine the entire material universe as conscious, it solves that problem of impermanence for me, because we've done studies on brain waves. Light dissipates as it travels through space, radio waves dissipate. Brain waves, interestingly, do not. So your brain waves are actually traveling through space 360 degrees from your body, and they just keep going. So how long have humans been on the planet? Something like 1,000,000 years. There's 1,000,000 years worth of brain waves that are just going out into the world. So to me, this idea of impermanence makes perfect sense. And that consciousness is, there's a permanence in consciousness. And of course, we don't know what consciousness is, but I think that they're linked somehow. I just muddled that explanation, but that's how I kind of approach things.
That was a very good piece of advice. Thank you, sir, for answering this question. Again, thank you all for attending today's webinar. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact us by email or telephone. We are happy to provide additional support to you. Please follow on our social media and subscribe our YouTube channel for new learnings.